Evening, very warm welcome to the Frontline Club for this discussion on journalism and the Assange case. As you can see, we have two guests on the stage, and perhaps not the expected for. Really bad luck, I'm afraid, this afternoon with flooding and so on. But we're very thankful to our two fantastic journalists who are here, as well as great contributors on the floor, I know. So it should be a terrific discussion. To chair that discussion and to introduce our other speaker is Richard Gizbert, who is the creator and presenter of the Listening Post on Al Jazeera, which covers exactly these sorts of questions we're thinking about this evening. Richard, over to you. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Max. First of all, can I remind everybody, phones on silent, please. You may want to shut some of them down in case the industrial military surveillance complex is tuning in tonight. I am thrilled to be joined tonight by Patrick Cockburn. Many of you will know him through his byline at The Independent. I first came across Patrick covering the wars in the former Yugoslavia in the 90s. Since then, he's been into all kinds of conflict areas and was covering the conflicts, Afghanistan and Iraq, at the time when WikiLeaks really made its first impact, early days. So we're going to get to questions relatively soon on the floor. We'll come to you sooner than we normally might. So please, if you have questions, prepare them. Try to keep them short, but I want to start with Patrick talking as a journalist in the field, working for a mainstream media organization. You were in Afghanistan the first time WikiLeaks made news with that collateral murder video, which was obtained after the military operations in Iraq. So why don't you start off by telling us a little bit what it was like for a mainstream media journalist to see this kind of information coming out the way it was?
So, yeah, I mean, the point I want to make generally is that Julian Assange is not only a journalist, but a great journalist, because he broke stories that are of enormous importance, and that is why he's being persecuted with such venom by the authorities in America and here. I think there's such a saga about what's happened over Julian Assange that it tends to obscure this very simple fact that he produced these stories, that he showed that governments lied, that military lied, not on trivial things, but issues that determine the history of the last 20 years. I was in Kabul in 2010 when this happened, and I was particularly, the thing that immediately struck me was the first thing that was revealed, which was a video of a terrible scene in Baghdad on 12th of July 2007, when a US military helicopter machine gunned, I think it was 10 or a dozen people on the ground, including two Reuters journalists. I was in Baghdad at the time, and the video shows these sort of jokey pilots and gunners shooting these people who, for no particularly good reason, they thought were rebels. In fact, they were journalists, they were children, there were people trying to rescue those who were running, and they killed them all. This was sort of an appalling atrocity. This was the sort of thing that the Gestapo did in France and Poland and Ukraine and elsewhere. It couldn't be worse. At the time, we knew, of course, that the military were lying and saying that these were rebels, because a couple of them were journalists who we knew. You know, they claimed that there were rebels standing in the street with guns. That never happened because there was not an American military helicopter overhead. Reuters pursued it, and it became known that this video existed, but they couldn't get hold of it. The Freedom of Information Act, they tried to get it, the Pentagon refused to give it up because they knew it showed they'd lied about the murder of these people and these children by the helicopter. Now that's what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks revealed. crimes by governments. Issues, you know, one can pick many things over the years. I was in Baghdad again in 2014, just after ISIS, Daesh had attacked, captured Mosul, advancing down towards Baghdad. There were stories that Saudi Arabia and Qatar were supporting them, financing them. This was denied by the US government. And then you discover from WikiLeaks, this was a later set of emails of Hillary Clinton, saying we must persuade the Saudis and others to stop supporting ISIS with money and logistics. You know, so these are very important issues, and I'm sure there are others that you can think of. There is one other point I'd like to make. When I was in Kabul at that time, and I just was accidentally seeing that day, the day they came out, a US official. It was a friend of mine couldn't come and see me. Somebody else, he sent another friend of his along. And I said, look, this has just come out. And he said, what's the coding on top? So he said, and then when I told him, he said, well, that's actually not sort of the most classified secrets. And of course, this is a point that I want to make, because continually people are saying somehow that Julian Assange, he endangered the names of agents, he, you know, acted like a spy, etc., etc. Now, this came from the archive he accessed had been developed after 9/11. It's called SIPRNet, which is like a military internet. After 9/11, the US security people thought there was lots of pockets of information, different parts of the security apparat that the rest of them couldn't access. So you needed a big archive that everybody could access. But of course, these don't have the names of agents and things like that there, because a sergeant like Chelsea Manning wouldn't have been able to access that type of information. The Pentagon and the security forces wouldn't have done that, and nobody would have worked for them if they did, because everybody would have known it was completely insecure. So this whole argument suggesting that Assange had revealed the names of agents, completely untrue. They weren't on this system, not the most classified information, although there's a pretense that they are.
So 2010, it started with that video called Collateral Murder, and I remember speaking to Julian Assange at the time saying, did you need to call it collateral murder? And he said, well, probably not, but we're still learning about this. Thereafter, we saw the Afghan war logs, which were highly instructive, the Iraq war logs, and then the diplomatic cables, the US diplomatic cables that pertained to situations, geopolitical situations around the planet. There's just one little anecdote that I found illuminating. I think it was around 2013, and Vaughn Smith, who owns the club that we're in today, was having a birthday party for Julian Assange in Norfolk. And the day before, what do you buy a dissident for his birthday? So I go to the Camden Market, I'm checking all the t-shirts, nothing applies. And then there's a place that says, we can make up any t-shirt you want. I said, perfect, black t-shirt, white letters. And I say to the two guys, I want FBI Witness Protection Program, and I'm gonna give it to Julian. And they said, fine, we'll be ready in 20 minutes, that'll be 20 pounds. And I said, you know who this is for? And these guys were Pakistanis. And they said, no, I said, it's for Julian Assange. And they're like, get out of here. And I'm like, no, it's his birthday, I'm buying him this t-shirt tomorrow. I come back and pick it up in 20 minutes, and they said, are you sure this is for Assange? And I said, it is. And they said, then there's no charge. And I said, why? And these guys knew their stuff. And they said, in the diplomatic cables, 8,000 of those cables came from the US Embassy in Islamabad. None of those cables revealed anything to us as Pakistanis that we did not know. But what the information did is it confirmed everything that we had alleged and that the government was denying. There's no charge for this t-shirt. I told Julian that the next day, and I thought, that's stupid, because now I haven't spent any money on his t-shirt, and he knows this. But during that day, there were presentations by various people, and I saw people from Honduras stand up with stories like the Pakistanis had. I saw people from Colombia stand up with stories like the Pakistanis had. If you talk to Tunisians today, they will insist that without the diplomatic cables revealing all the wrongdoing by President Ben Ali, the Tunisian dictator at the time, and that of his wife, and all the characterization of that by American diplomats, which was identical to everything that the Tunisian opposition was saying, but that the Americans were denying. And I take your point on Iraq, on Afghanistan, invaluable information, but the diplomatic cables, because they pertained to everything, changed the narrative in many, many places. There's a very good argument that can be made that Julian Assange did more than anyone else to end the Iraq War. And he probably did more to end that war than Daniel Ellsberg, who is treated as a hero today in America, did to end the Vietnam War. The technology was different. Ellsberg had to photocopy 7,000 pages. Assange has had access to infinitely more information. Yet still, these misconceptions exist. And I'm in my office today, and I mentioned I'm doing this Assange thing to a young journalist who's a graduate of Goldsmith. She's very smart. And then she says something like, oh, Assange, rapey bastard. Hold on a second, Claire. And I walk her through the story. And to say that, you know, even Al Jazeera, which is very careful with this kind of stuff, you know, you'll hear on CNN, Julian Assange charged with rape, factually incorrect. Even rape allegations is factually incorrect, and Al Jazeera has reported that. And I guess my question for you, Patrick, is we see media get stories wrong all the time. I mean, you were in Iraq. It's the land of alleged WMDs. You know, talk about media getting a story wrong. But has there ever been a case of the media being so off on the coverage of a story of this importance that pertains and centers on one of its own, a journalist? Or is it that they don't see him as one of their own, and is that where the issue lies?
I mean, Assange has been smeared and deliberately smeared, and this comes from governments. You know, why is he in Belmarsh prison? As if he was some sort of dangerous member of ISIS or something like that. You know, to give the impression that this is a dangerous person, that it's not just a journalist. Why do journalists not see that? There's certain things, you know, allegations of, you know, there's certain things like rape, allegations of racism, that you can turn somebody into a pariah without anything being proved, or indeed anything being true. But if you mention the accusation often enough, then that mud is going to stick. I mean, it's a pretty old trick, it's not new, but it's been used much more systematically these days, and certainly it's being used against him.
But what sets this apart, and journalists will often, you know, maybe they'll fall for a narrative like that, maybe they'll fight a narrative like that, but there seemed to be too much acceptance of that narrative. And there is this relationship between mainstream media and Julian Assange, which is at the very least problematic, given that news organizations like the New York Times, like The Guardian, Der Spiegel, Libération, and the rest of them, who were all part of those coalitions, they took that information, they published that information. They may have done a more thorough job in redacting some of that information than WikiLeaks did on its own. They benefited, they profited, they got the clicks, but I've seen too much abandonment on the part of the mainstream media of what is arguably their most important source of this century than would make me comfortable.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, you know, there are a number of things. One is simple fear. They're frightened. They see what's happened to Assange. They don't want it to happen to them. They know governments don't like this. They'll really go after anybody who's pursuing this. So there are advantages then, even if they published what Assange provided for them, they want to put a distance between them and Assange. And they'll do it, you know, some of this is conscious, some of this is unconscious, but you can sense them wanting them to distance themselves from what he did. I think there's another thing about journalists. You know, journalists, generalization, but journalists often want to think of themselves as sort of independent, that they find out about government, they investigate. but journalists are often a conduit of information from governments. So when you have this enormous amount of information that has been revealed about governments, kind of, you know, somebody else has done their job and done it better. People don't like that.
There's definitely an element of that. WikiLeaks hasn't been that active or as active as it was before, obviously, but the archives that do exist and are there for the searching are valuable. And I want to bring in Mohammed El-Mazi, who's, well, I'll give you he'll give you his own affiliations because there's more than one organization that he's associated with. But talk to us a little bit, Mohammed, about the archive and how you are still finding journalistic value in it today. You may want to stand up and project.
Thanks. My name is Mohammed El-Mazi. I'm a journalist and contributor with the Canary, the Grey Zone, and Sputnik International, along with a few others. Yeah, we were discussing before I came what it is that you mentioned, that anytime I want to cover any subject, including, let's say, for example, Venezuela, you know, something's going on in Venezuela, one of the things I will do, especially if I want to have a background piece, I want to put things into context, is I'll go straight to WikiLeaks, go to its database, and I'll put in a name. And I'll see the name of the country or a name of an official and see documents. You know, I found one document from the Carter era, discussing from somebody in the embassy, I think it was the ambassador, discussing it was a country profile, and they were saying these are our lists of our strategic interests in Venezuela, and one of them was human rights, and the rest were various natural resources, business opportunities, security, etc. Although they did note at the end that there has been no follow-up on the matter of human rights. So while it was listed as like a box that had to be ticked, that person who drafted that document, a detailed document, noted that like human rights, it was just a single sentence saying there's been no follow-up on the matter of human rights.
Valuable context.
Yeah, exactly. And that just shows, you know, sometimes putting things in historical context can help. I mean, that's just like a very small example, but I'm just trying to pick something out of left field.
Do you have any other thoughts on the hearing, on the perception and the depiction of Julian Assange in media, mainstream and otherwise?
I think it's already been said that if you don't want to deal with a story, then you start to characterize or mischaracterize the messenger of the story. So while it's not to say that a messenger is never important, right? So if Dick Cheney says something, then you know the fact that he is who he is and we know what we know about him makes a difference. Although, as it's been said, unlike I think it's been said already that WikiLeaks has a 100% accuracy rate in terms of its publications. I don't know if they've ever had to retract a story or a document as being improperly sent to them or as being a fake document. Where I don't have 100%
Neither do I.
track record. I've had to come up and come back and update things.
Retract.
So it is interesting that somebody who has that track record, yeah, if you want to focus, if you want to distract from the content, then yeah, then you focus about the person, you talk about what they're wearing, did they feed their cat, was he skateboarding in the embassy, and all the rest of it. Interestingly, if people want to know what things were like in the embassy, they can always speak to the former diplomats from Ecuador who have been more than willing to discuss what things were like during the many years that they came to know Julian Assange. In terms of the court case, I'll just say this, is that the way things were represented in the press after we left, not every paper, in fact many of them, their headlines alone, I would say, misrepresented the nature of what was said in court regarding an alleged pardon. So we'll just have to wait and see. WikiLeaks has come out with a tweet. We'll just wait and see what the statement says.
Sorry, you're talking about the story that emerged today.
That emerged, well, it emerged, what was that, yesterday now? The days are merging into each other now. Yeah, in court, where it was indirectly suggested that Donald Trump had, via a US congressperson, offered Julian Assange a pardon in exchange for him saying or confirming that Russia was not involved in the DNC leaks. Of course, he's already said that. He said that in 2016. He said that to Sean Hannity on Fox News. So I was trying to say this to people, to journalists outside of court. not only has he already said that, but we need to wait to see what's actually in the witness statement that the barrister was referring to,
Right.
rather than treating that as a statement of fact from the barrister.
The misreporting on Assange continues to this very day. Just one more point I want to make before throwing it to the floor. Patrick may have another point as well. But I mean, I can remember, Patrick, sitting around in, would have been, I guess, 2012, 2013 or so, when WikiLeaks was at its publication height. Afghan war logs, Iraq war logs. And I remember sitting around at a dinner party or in a pub discussing WikiLeaks with people, other journalists and non-journalists. And I remember the general notion being put out there that, geez, I wonder how long they're going to let them continue this for. We all had those discussions, didn't we, back in the day? And then the rape story, which is completely bogus, comes out of Sweden, and everything changes. And as I was telling my female colleague today, who didn't know the story and had swallowed the mainstream narrative fairly whole, I said, if this was a movie and we saw a Jason Bourne type, journalistic character putting the American security establishment at risk by revealing the truth, and then was alleged to have been involved in a sex crime with no concrete evidence, we'd all get it. We'd all figure it out. I don't know what happened to the mic,
Yeah.
but
Sorry, carry on. Sorry.
Censorship.
as cinema goers, if we saw that, we would see it for what it is. But why is it that when it unfolds in real life, we fall victim to the ploy? And I can't tell you how many times I've said this kind of thing to somebody, and then a female or a male in some cases will say to me, well, you're not saying the sexual assault isn't important, are you? And I'm like, of course I'm not saying that, and that's why they picked that crime, because it can undermine on so many levels that are non-political, that are personal. But I do find it curious that if we're watching a movie, something that it would appear obvious to us, but when it happens in real life, people are far more confused.
Yeah, and also I think, it provides an excuse for quite a lot of people. I'm not sure how, I think a lot of people, I don't think we all, how many people really thought that, but it provides an excuse for newspapers, television. People don't really want to touch the story anyway because it's going to irritate the government and so forth, to back away from it. So it provides, it enables them to not, pursue this story as an attack on journalism, attack on freedom of expression, which it quite certainly is. It's also in keeping, I notice more and more, my journalistic career is quite long now, but of systematic character assassination of people who governments don't like and so forth, that's where they're looking for some weak spot that they can go after to diffuse or give pariah status to some journalist or some television stars or some newspaper. Because it's not just Assange. We can talk about this later. This is one episode in a sort of general assault on freedom of expression on multiple levels on my mind, and that's why it's so worrying. It reminds me of I used to know Turkey quite well. You'd see journalists had a very fine independent press, and how quickly that was sort of beaten to the ground by the government. Taking over media organizations, intimidating the owners, jailing the journalists and so forth. Freedom of expression is a pretty sort of fragile flower. And when a government wants to go after it, they can extinguish it pretty fast. And I think that Assange is quite an essential element of this. People notice what happened to him. They don't want the same thing to happen to them.
There's an element of that. Any questions from the floor? We'll get a microphone to you. If you'd like to give a name and affiliation, feel free to do that. That's not mandatory. Well, the microphone is.
Thanks. Could you comment on the chopping up of hard disks in the basement of The Guardian and the chilling effects that had?
Well, I don't remember that much about that story, but that was under Rusbridger's watch, was it not?
Mm-hmm.
And they came in, and that was to do with the Heathrow incident as well, wasn't it?
Snowden, Doug. Right?
Yeah, it was Snowden related, and Glenn Greenwald's partner,
David Miranda,
was pulled over. I get the feeling you want to comment on it.
Not particularly, but I think it's, although it's not directly Assange, it's very much about the same kind of story.
Right, and the other thing about Assange and The Guardian is that relationship can be best described as complicated.
Mm-hmm.
Anything on that, Patrick?
Well, complicated, yeah, but I mean, you know, the differences that they had seem to me generally pretty trivial, given, you know, what he was doing, what he had done. You know, the WikiLeaks revelations, they're a sort of portal into the world as it really is, as in contrast to the world that the governments would like to present to people. And that's why they've reacted so strongly to this.
Yes.
And you know, you talked about, you know, Pakistanis getting this T-shirt, they knew it, but this confirmed it. You know, I had exactly the same feeling. You know, not Yemen. People say the US, State Department, Pompeo, we say the Houthis backed by Iran, getting weapons from Iran. You find WikiLeaks thing from the US Embassy in Sana'a saying, investigate this, it's slightly earlier period. Houthis don't get their weapons from Iran, they buy it in the local black market. Yemen is one of the biggest arms markets in the world. Now, anybody who's been to Yemen knows this, but here you had it confirmed by the US Embassy, and it completely contradicted everything else they said. Sorry, I don't want to give much. So this was the truth. What they've been saying was a lie. We knew it because of what WikiLeaks did.
The other thing is, you know, when people talk to me about, and this is tangential to what you referred to, but on Assange's complicated relationship with The Guardian, and I asked Alan Rusbridger about this when he was still editing the paper. You know, journalists don't always get along, and you have to think about cultures. You know, you're a blogger, you're a researcher, you're sitting in the proverbial pajamas in your room doing all this work, you're a solo artiste, you're an IT person. We'll go to this question next. And those people, you know, they tend not to have to work in teams. You know, and just culturally, it's a different thing. I've seen print journalists come into television and learning that they can't work in a team. They've only ever worked with one person ever, the editor, and they never stop complaining about him. And you know, and so, you know, there are certain boring practical things. And if you're coming out of an uber individual life culture, which is technology, which is where he came from, then you set up an organization that's 6 or 8 people deep, like WikiLeaks was. And you're going to have some problems there, because these are all people that are like that, individuals who live in a tech world, not in a real world. And then can you imagine then going into a news organization like The Guardian and then trying to get along with them? You know, so there are some quite pragmatic, quite mundane reasons why journalists of Assange's ilk do not fit easily into systems and organizations like The Guardian, even as a collaborator. We have a question here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was, this is many years ago, this is pre-internet, I was once warned that because I'd criticised a foreign government, that my name and somebody, a national of that government, said they were concerned that the government would pass my name and address to terrorists, with the obvious implication I could be in danger. 2 short questions. You said that the mud sticks thing on the alleged sexual allegations, you said they're completely bogus. What indicators do you use to decide they are completely bogus? And second point, slightly off topic, I apologise for that. I saw a report today that a senior person in the OSCE has raised an issue of journalist freedom today, saying we must not forget Jan Kuciak and his fiancée. This is the second anniversary of their deaths.
Slovak journalist.
Yes. Is there any indication that the media, and particularly perhaps the fully international media, which operates in several languages, going to take that case up? Because I feel there's a danger that because it's not as familiar for the English language audience, that might also get forgotten.
Thank you. I can't answer that question, but there are burgeoning problems in many Central European countries on the journalism side. Slovakia is one of them, Poland's another, Hungary is even further along. I think that when it comes to significant action being taken by the authorities, that would have to come through the EU. But the problem with the EU and journalism is they're very good at demanding certain journalistic standards of countries that are applying for EU membership. Your journalism has got to be in good shape for the, and the EU can repel you or refuse your entry application if your media isn't up to the standards of freedom that are contained, that are held in Brussels. But once you're in the EU is virtually powerless to do anything.
I first-hand
observation. Look, the Turks will complain about this. They will say to you, okay, no matter what you think of Erdogan and what he's done with the Turkish media, we're being lectured to by Brussels while, and this is while Berlusconi is in power, controlling 4 of the 6 television networks in a founding EU state. You were saying about the mud sticks, I forget.
Basically, what conditions do you use to decide? You said that the sexual allegations, assault allegations are completely bogus.
Julian Assange slept with, Julian Assange went to Stockholm, went to Sweden to speak at 2 events. He was in demand. He was put up after both speeches in homes of people who were involved with the organizations that had invited him. Both of them were women. The first one was in Stockholm. He stayed there that night. They had consensual sex. In the morning, she had an issue with him not using a condom. Later that day, when Assange is on a train, later that day, they attend a barbecue together, a bunch of people. The woman tweets a photograph and says that she's at a barbecue with the coolest people in the world. Now, women who feel that they've been sexually assaulted, they don't have to come up with that story on day 1 or day 2. They are free to reassess later, when their minds are clear, and they are completely free to bring allegations to the authorities. That is not what happened. He gets on a train, goes to a second city. I'm thinking it's Gothenburg, I may be wrong. Again, put up by the organization, again, a female, again, they have sex, and similar occurrence. The next day, female number 2, when Assange is on a train, going back to Stockholm, where he's going to stay with female number 1. Female number 2 phones female number 1, says who she knows, and says, I understand Julian's staying there tonight. Just want to let you know that we slept together last night and had sex, so maybe you don't want him to stay there. And she said, no, in fact I do. A few days later, the 2 women, having compared notes, were disturbed by what happened. They went to the police in Stockholm. They did not go with allegations of sexual assault of any kind. They went with a question, which was, do we have the legal right to compel this man to take an STD test for sexually transmitted diseases? That is what they asked for, and they asked for nothing more. The government got hold of that, and stories of sexual assault allegations and reports on CNN of sexual assault charges all emanated from that. anyone out there wants to correct me if they think I'm wrong, but I don't think that story's changed. Where's the next question, Max? We mustn't have a front row bias. They may have paid more. Well, let's.
I just wanted to add, rather than contradict.
You need a microphone.
Yes. So Professor Niels Meltzer has written a 19-page document that identifies over 50 violations of Swedish rule of law and due process. You could read that, but one of the most serious things was the police officer actually changing one of the women's statements, actually signing it. Woman SW didn't sign her statement, a statement at all, and that was modified in a way that whereby the case could be reopened. That was the police officer. Going to the press as well.
Yeah.
That's against Swedish law, but there's over 50 of those.
Yeah, and let's not forget the context. You know, Sweden has a reputation for being a benign social democracy that treats everybody well. This was a rendition country. Americans who were renditing under extraordinary circumstances in the post 9/11 world, all kinds of suspects who had nothing to do with anything. We've all heard those stories. One of the countries that those people were being rendited through was Sweden. That country is not as cuddly as most of us have been led to believe. You have a question?
Okay,
Again,
yeah.
anyone wants to throw out a name or an affiliation, I
It's the
always
last
find that's helpful.
front row
Last front row
question in
question?
the Frontline Club.
How do you feel about that?
You want one?
Well, no, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm
We're
sorry.
taking
I
it to the
didn't-
back after this, to the
Didn't see you
people,
sitting
to
there.
the people.
No, I'm Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News. This is Kathy Bogan, executive producer of our webcast. On the informant, it's about revealing names of informants. Now, if you look at the indictment, the list of all the statutes that he allegedly violated, there's nothing about informants. It's not against the law in the U.S. But much of that indictment is all this window dressing to try to PR operation to make him seem like he endangered people's lives, and he never did. That's
Yeah, and
one-
eventually the U.S. military admitted that nobody came to any
Right,
harm
and
as a result of the
That's
Afghan
right.
logs.
In fact, they did. And Mark Davis, an Australian journalist who was in the bunker at The Guardian during that period, had said a couple of months ago that it was Assange who stayed up all night on Friday night to expunge names from there, and that The Guardian really didn't give a damn. He also alleged that the New York Times misled him, wanting the WikiLeaks to publish first, so they would be more at risk, and that the Times could say we only repeated what they said. But I have a question. This case, it's not hyperbole, I think, to say that this case really goes to the heart of defining Western, or at least US and British society. Are we, as they're acting the way the most aggressive totalitarian society would, like Slovakia, let's say, or others, against a journalist who's revealed truth like that. Is it too much to say that this case is so significant that it would help define whether the US and Britain are really democracies or not?
What do you think, Patrick?
Well, you know, it's an erosion of democracy, you know, which you see on every side, you know, and particularly in this country, you know, attacks on the Supreme Court, closing down Parliament, you know, attacks on the BBC, attacks on freedom of expression on multiple fronts. This is one of them. You know, will these succeed? I don't think one should depress oneself to the point of saying democracy is over. You know, the battle's lost. The battle is still going on. This is one front in the battle. You know, if you look at the Times this morning, you know, somewhere, you know, deep inside the newspaper, it quotes an official in the Home Office saying that the difference between the permanent secretary, who Priti Patel is trying to get rid of, and Priti Patel is he believes in the rule of law and she doesn't. You know, there's this official in the Home Office who's dealing with this. You know, doesn't believe in the rule of law. You know, this has been the tradition of authoritarian, populist, nationalist regimes, you know, in the 20s and 30s, you know, big on law and order, but in fact, a contempt for the law. And that's what we're seeing here.
You know, the other thing that this reminds me of, a few years ago I saw a documentary, it's a great documentary on, do you remember Napster?
Mm-hmm.
Napster was the first of the free music services, and it was the whole story of the legal case against Napster. and all the lawyers who were hired, and the record industry who was.
Should we just take one moment, see if I can sort this?
So this documentary is a great documentary on Napster, and it's a war between the music industry, which has never had to deal with this kind of thing before, and 6 guys in Boston who have got the technology figured out, and the market, which is hungry for free music. And the legal case follows, Metallica gets involved, a bunch of other bands get involved, and eventually Napster is taken down by the American courts. And there's the video of all these music industry lawyers in Los Angeles clinking their glasses, saying, well, that's sorted. What kind of shape is the music industry in today? Their problem wasn't Napster. Their problem was the technology, all right? And the Pentagon's problem isn't Assange, it isn't WikiLeaks, it's the technology. But that's what happens when you have developments like this and authorities are trying to control them. They personalize it down into someone, and I think in certain respects they may actually even believe if we put this guy in jail, we're going to solve our problem. Well, until they jail the technology, I'm afraid they're in for a disappointment. Where's
Are you so sure about that? I don't know. People always like to think, well, you can jail one person, you know, but others will come forward, you know. Because I deal with the Middle East, where they're in the habit of jailing people, particularly journalists, and shooting them for that matter. It does work if you do it often enough. You frighten people. You frighten the people who own newspapers, radios, everything else. And you'll close it down, or you'll close it into a small minority. It'll become a minority thing. You know. The authoritarian countries, they have, you know, one sort of vaguely free newspaper, sometimes in the English language, so they can go to all the embassies to give the impression that the place isn't a sort of
Moscow Times.
Fascist dictatorship. Yeah.
Moscow Times. Where's the mic?
No, a private citizen, no affiliation. Just a couple of questions. One is, given the content of WikiLeaks and the way Julian Assange has been treated, what does that say about United States foreign policy, number one? And number two, can the battle for the truth ever be won?
I don't think it tells us anything about American foreign policy we didn't already know, because it's happened under administrations of both political stripes. Can the battle for truth be won? I can provide you with no concrete answer, but we're all here for that reason, and we must believe. I have nothing more profound to say about it, or profound at all to say about it.
Can I make a point? Actually, a little bit of family history. My father was a journalist on the Times between, I think it was 1928 to 1933, when he resigned from the Times because he didn't like their editorial line, and set up a little publication newsletter called The Week, which was quite famous in its day. It had lots of scoops and so forth. And I always wondered how influential it was, you know, because this was a thing that arrived, a little sort of grubby brown paper, 6 pages inside a grubby brown envelope. And then in about, 2003, I applied to MI5 for his MI5 file in the National Archives in Kew. And nothing happened, and then they did deposit it there. And there were 24 different folders on my father. And then you find, I found rather encouraging, that, you know, any revelation, even in this small little publication, you know, you'd find letters from members of the cabinet to people in MI5 saying, can't we arrest this man, you know, what the Crown prosecution's doing, you know, endless stuff. And it was rather encouraging because it shows how those in authority are so sensitive and vulnerable to anybody revealing what they're up to.
It's not a new thing.
It's not new, no. And I think one can sort of over-depress oneself. Of thinking, you know, here's the mass power of the US government, of the Pentagon, of the CIA, of MI5, of all these other guys. And one should remind oneself how vulnerable they feel to any sort of revelation, even quite small revelations, and why they become so hysterical when there's a major one by WikiLeaks.
We have a question here.
My name is Marcus Hefliger. I'm a member of this great club and also a foreign correspondent in this country for Neue Zürcher Zeitung and Swiss Daily. I don't think Julian Assange should be extradited to the US, but I also feel uneasy at the glorification of Julian Assange. Let me tell you why. I think, first off, that governments have a right to secrecy and of having secrets, otherwise they couldn't plan military operations, keep their citizens safe, or, since we are in the post-Brexit phase, conduct trade negotiations. Having said that, of course, when there are human rights violations, important lies of members of government, or other unethical behavior, the press, when it comes across it, has a right or a duty to expose it. But it should be done, in my view, on a case-by-case basis, and it should be accompanied by the probing of the journalists concerned, whether they should weigh up whether the costs to infringing on secrecy is warranted by the benefits of exposing a crime. And in all the cases that we know, like Pentagon Papers, this was done by journalists, and they struggled with the question whether they should go ahead and could go ahead. WikiLeaks did nothing of the sort. They published secrets in bulk, wholesale, without probing it. Now, to me, this is not journalism.
Well, let me just say real quick. I would be happy to leave Julian Assange unglorified if the authorities left him as a free man. There are narratives out there that are being peddled which are not based in fact. And when you say that Julian Assange published material with no regard to the impact, that's false. Yeah. During the publication of both the Afghan war logs and Iraq war logs, the New York Times and other American partners of WikiLeaks went to the Pentagon, talked about material that they wanted to publish, consulted with the security people there, took advice, and then made decisions. Julian Assange and WikiLeaks attempted to do the exact same thing. The same officials at the Pentagon who were happy to talk to the New York Times, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, and the rest of them refused to provide WikiLeaks with the very same guidance they were providing mainstream news organizations. It's a false rap. Have you fallen asleep?
No, I was a bit surprised somebody said the glorification of Julian Assange. Seems to me that the main theme has been a sort of smearing of Julian Assange.
Yes.
I think you're just mistaken with saying he's being glorified. Quite the contrary. It's fairly sort of systematic character assassination to my mind. I also don't have the same trust in governments. And why are they so angry? I don't think it's because this has impeded their activities, their legal activities. I think what enrages them is that so many things that they were suspected of doing, is suddenly their own people are admitting that they did them. That's why they're so angry.
The microphone lives where? Yes?
I don't want to speak for too long, so I think there's lots of other people. My name is Imogen Folks. I work for BBC. I'm BBC's Geneva correspondent. And I don't think Julian Assange belongs in Belmarsh prison, but neither do I think he's a saint. And
neither am
what I'm a little bit concerned at the start of the talk from both of you that you were using this term mainstream media, and you were kind of subtly suggesting that journalists are either frightened or jealous.
There are elements of both.
Well, yeah, maybe I could speak for, because you've had quite a long time. I think that, you know, what really worries me is that here we are in the Frontline Club, and you are adopting the language about journalists of Donald Trump. And you have, this is how you started. That dismays me. It really does dismay me. I'm not criticizing Julian Assange, it's just the way you have gone about his defense worries me. I don't think we need to make the case in that way. And secondly, honestly, as a woman, I think this detail about the sexual life, I kind of think it demeans you to go through all of that.
It means me.
Yeah, I do. I think it demeans
Was I in Sweden?
No, but you were telling the truth.
Yeah, well, if the truth is demeaning, then please accept my apologies. Listen, when I am critical of the mainstream media, I do that as a member of the mainstream media. I'm not sitting on the outside. I'm not a blogger taking pot shots. I work for a mainstream media news organization. I am not so naive to think that news organizations such as my own and people who work in them aren't compromised. That doesn't mean I'm Donald Trump. That's not me saying fake news. What you're dealing in is a false equivalence. It's wrong. Who's next?
Can I say something? I think it's appalling having to hear from a woman saying such actually inventions or lies. You should read Niels Melzer report. You should read Niels Melzer report. And have a little bit of respect for his position as a UN rapporteur on torture. And what exactly happened in Sweden. You're not offending any women by taking this position.
Yeah, but apparently it demeans me. Question in the back?
Julian Assange case is not a glorification. If it wasn't for Julian Assange, the truth wouldn't have come out. And the people in question was Iraqis, and they are humans like us, sitting here. No difference.
Next door.
Sorry, hi. So I have a question that's more or less foreign policy oriented as well. So, especially with Julian Assange and a Washington Post posting an article about implicating that IMF granted the revoke of Julian Assange refugee status was at suspicious timing of a IMF grant. I'm not saying there's something wrong with that, but I'm just saying that do you think personally that, especially with public opinions, would these cases, especially with Julian Assange, with Edward Snowden, would this just be a headline of the last news cycle, or would this actually make a great impact in U.S. image globally, especially in the developing countries? And would we see a more or less of an improvise of the propaganda campaign method in the developing countries, especially?
I'm not sure I can help you at all because I'm not familiar with the IMF case to which you refer. I don't know if Patrick is any more comfortable with that. I'm sorry I can't help you with that.
Got a loan in exchange for Korea was ousted or left government.
Oh yeah. Oh, you have a microphone. You have a microphone there.
New guy came in called Lenin Moreno, I think, and the IMF loan was given to the Ecuadorians very shortly before Lenin Moreno let the British police take Assange from the embassy by force, which I think is a first ever in diplomatic history.
Right, yes. and it's all coming back to me now. We actually reported on that. And I think the figure was it 4 billion or 6 billion?
10.4.
4.2 billion?
No.
And I think the way we put it was, we now know what, the price of Ecuadorian complicity with the Pentagon and Langley is. It's $4.2 billion. Okay, but that's a different side of it, right? I mean, that pertains to his relationship with the Ecuadorians, how much protection they were willing to offer him. And Moreno came in obviously wanting to make nice with Washington. Correa is sitting in Brussels, presumably with a very good story to tell that he's not telling so much. But then, so there are multiple tracks on this story, but the one that has him in jail now, because the Ecuadorians weren't providing him with shelter anymore, is obviously the American-British legal initiative. Patrick, do you want to say anything on that? You leave me out here dry. There's a question here, and another one behind you.
Two questions, if I may. Firstly, in your view, why has Assange and WikiLeaks made such a big impression and changed your world so much? Is it his ability to get hold of information, or is it his ability and WikiLeaks' ability to disseminate it? That's the first one.
Well, and phase one with WikiLeaks was WikiLeaks putting it out there and letting people go through it. And Assange learned that although he was obviously filling a hole that the mainstream media wasn't filling, he would have limited impact in keeping that model in place without expanding. And governments weren't thrilled with Julian Assange. But the timing of the court case and all the official aggression from America coincided or followed his combined work that he did with mainstream media. So they didn't like him while he was putting this stuff online and making people like you and I go look for it. They learned to hate him once he was feeding these mainstream news organizations and putting those stories in front of millions of more people than would bother to go look for them themselves. I don't know if that helps.
My question was more, was the information that WikiLeaks have been putting out there information that the rest of the journalistic establishment was not able to find or access, or simply they were not able to put it out there for whatever reason?
Well, they clearly couldn't access it, And one of the good things about it is that you have the whole of these cables. They aren't sort of little bits of information. You can see the context of what's happening from these. You may remember some time ago, I think it was the Daily Mail published the telegrams from the British ambassador in Washington, which were critical of Trump, and who then attacked the ambassador, who was then withdrawn. These weren't, these were just parts of the cables, so you couldn't see the context in which they took place. So actually what WikiLeaks did was much, in a sense, more honest or much fuller account of what was happening. And by the way, I didn't notice the person at the Daily Mail who got hold of these British cables being had up. Were they?
No, I haven't heard of that.
It's funny that, isn't it?
It's hilarious.
And these, of course, contemporary cables. They're not like most of what WikiLeaks published, which were of, went years back. So so you have the whole cable. So this gives you a real picture of what was happening in Iraq or Afghanistan or Pakistan, and what governments really knew. It'd be very difficult for any journalist to do that, to get that sort of information. You might sort of sense that was happening, write about it, but this is governments in their own words saying what was happening, confirming what the reality is.
Yeah. And just one other point, just a historical point, because what we're talking about is lies. Right? We're talking about all the lies that government tells, all the lies that they've since had to create to get Assange behind bars, and all the lies that they've been telling to keep him there. But the irony is that the Chelsea Manning leaks were a byproduct of another big lie, and that was post-Iraq war. The Americans were saying, actually, the intelligence was not misleading, it was incorrect and we were all fooled. Yeah, that's it, right? And our 18 intelligence services, because that's how many America has, because America apparently needs 18 different intelligence agencies. they weren't all talking to each other. We weren't swapping the information sufficiently. Remember that line that we got from them? Utter bullshit. Okay? August 2001, a month before 9/11, Bush has reports, intelligence reports, delivered to him in Crawford, Texas, saying that bin Laden plans to attack America using commercial airliners. Everybody knew. But the Americans, they had to come up with this they had to protect the Bush administration from not being ready for this when they had the data. They had to then come up with some kind of cockamamie line about, oh, how did we all get this WMDs thing wrong? It must be communications. Left hand must not be talking to the right hand from our 18 different intelligence agencies. So what we're going to do is we are going to be better at sharing this information. And what they did was, the kind of classified data that Chelsea Manning got, to which Patrick was referring earlier, was limited to something, I may have the numbers wrong, but something like 1.1 million Americans working in intelligence, defense, and everything, who had the necessary security clearance to get at all that stuff. But what they then did is that they lowered that threshold, and I think the final number of people who then had access to that data was somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 million. So by a factor of 100 or 150%, they're increasing the number of people who have access to this and therefore exposing themselves to a far greater risk of leaks. Chelsea Manning, sitting in Afghanistan, in that position, prior to 9/11, well, he wouldn't have been in Afghanistan, nobody at his level would have had that level of clearance. But because they lowered the threshold, a whole lot more people came in. Manning then provided Assange with all that information and just putting the lie to so much of American foreign policy and the stories we were telling as a result of another lie that Americans were being fed in 2003.
You see, governments have a problem, I think, that they have their official position on this. They say something's happening in Iraq or Afghanistan and so forth. But then you've got your own apparat, and you can't have them operating on the basis of the untruths that you've been telling the rest of the public. So you need to have a band of information which is true. And it can't be just held by a couple of dozen people. You have to tell all your guys if they're fighting a war in Afghanistan. That's why they lowered the bar. They actually had to know what was really happening rather than what the government was actually saying. So there was a sort of, the fact that they did this was kind of an omission, that they had to get true information to their own people. It's very difficult. There are lots of things as a journalist. It's very difficult to prove it. I was in Mosul during the 9-month siege of Mosul. Around that, you knew that they were bombing. Americans were bombing everything. You knew there were heavy civilian casualties, but they very difficult to prove that. Now, occasionally journalists can do that. There was some guy, a friend, people I know on the New York Times magazine, spent months going villages around Mosul, interviewing people to see how many people had been killed compared to what the US Air Force said that they'd done. In one town, a place called Kayara, south of Mosul, the US Air Force said they'd killed 1 civilian. Real figure, 43 dead, mostly women and children. Very difficult to prove that, but that's the sort of thing that WikiLeaks, has the government admitting this. Often you'll suspect this, but you can't quite get it, but they'll lie the whole time. We all know it's much easier to tell a lie than to disprove a lie. That's why people lie so much. And it's very difficult to disprove it. And that seems to be what WikiLeaks did. That's why they're so angry. And the idea that, as our Swiss colleague said, you should leave it to governments, and wait and sit, balance what's the good or bad, Well, governments always think anything negative about themselves is bad. Erdogan thinks anything that is negative about himself, therefore, is good for the Kurds and others, people who are opposed to him, and they're of course terrorists. Therefore, people who report this are terrorists. They put them in jail. It's naive, extraordinarily naive, to think that governments applaud any sort of negative information about themselves.
It also reminds me of some stories over the years. Friends of mine, colleagues of ours, and I'm sure colleagues of yours have done the same, and they've gone to go work for governments. and they may have covered foreign affairs or something, and they go work with the department responsible, and on the way in they're like, oh, this is good, I'm gonna get to learn all those secrets that I as a journalist haven't been able to get, you know, rubbing their hands, and they go in and they go for the briefings, and they learn absolutely nothing they didn't already know, but they're simply having it confirmed. So the information's out there, we can all get at it, it's denied at an official level, and therefore no action is taken. You know, one of the great fringe benefits of having WikiLeaks was we didn't have to actually take a job in the government to find out what, you know, to find out that what we knew was basically everything. And again, he didn't tell us much we didn't know. He just confirmed for the people in Tunisia, and Honduras, and Pakistan, and all those countries, the stuff that they did know, and he put the lie to what the officials were giving in return. That, to me, is the enduring value. There's another question at the back here.
Hiya, thank you. I would just have a short question on the detail. I'm not sure whether I understood that correctly or not. Assange has published the full names of informants in Afghanistan and Iraq, is that correct? And did you say that no one has come to any harm afterwards, after the names have been published? It was just because for me as a journalist that would be quite a responsibility to think of what happens to people whose name I'm publishing. So
in the first set of congressional hearings after the release of the Afghan war logs, American generals were called before congressional hearings, and they laid out a lot of the allegations in broad brush narratives saying, Afghan collaborators have been put in danger as a result of these revelations. And an editorial, an editorial in the guise of a news piece written by a journalist named John Burns, who you will be familiar with, a Canadian, a long time at the New York Times. And it was basically a hatchet job on Julian Assange, talking to a bunch of critics, the people he had fallen out with at WikiLeaks, including Daniel, who was his partner in the organization, people talking about his eating habits, people talking about Julian Assange's problematic body odor. And I don't think we've ever had a finer example of the compromised position that Julian Assange put news organizations into. You know, remember, this is the New York Times. They published the Pentagon Papers, all right? And they cannot deny the news value. Their competitive instincts, their journalistic instincts, and that nonsense about all the news that's fit to print on the banner, that's all taken care of on that side of the page. But at the very same, in the very same paper, on the very same day, they feel the need to take their source down. It's like the Times printing all the Pentagon Papers material and then doing a hatchet job on Ellsberg on the other side of the page. They didn't do that. And what they showed us on that day, in the clearest possible way, was the compromises that organizations that still, you know, have a lust for news, the compromises that they must go through to function in America today. We're just about done here because Max likes to wrap it up by 8:30. We have a question at the back. Go.
I just had some comments. I think what I understood was kind of who was prosecuting him, and the prosecution is the U.S. attorney, and it's our taxpayers that are paying for it, for his prosecution. But I think WikiLeaks has to pay for its own defense. There was something also about which things WikiLeaks decides to report on, whether it's the actual regimes that are very dangerous, and Iran, etc. I don't think WikiLeaks does that. It doesn't kind of choose what to report on. It has an open Dropbox in which people can anonymously put information about anything. And the reason I think other journalists don't take up that approach is because usually there's thousands of documents that are put in there, and they kind of put them to journalists in certain areas according to their expertise, who decide what is redacted and what is not. And in fact, even with the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs, a lot was redacted. I think something like 50,000 of the original 90,000 documents were put out. So there was a lot of redaction. There was a lot of talking to journalists, a lot of decision about what should be put out, what should be put out. That was it. I think I wanted to also ask.
Just one more point.
Yes.
Name me a major news organization today that does not have a WikiLeaks style Dropbox on its website.
Exactly.
They all do. Again, their problem was not Assange. Their problem is the technology. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes. I think the question was, is there a way of making Julian Assange a hero again via the media? Or do you think this speaks about our general problem of our own worldview, in which we've been raised to have, heroes and villains, and in some sense we're almost attacking Julian for not being the hero that we wanted him to be? Is there any way that the media can effectively still separate a person from the issues that surround them?
Well, a white cowboy hat would help. No, I take your point. It's a serious point. Look, I don't know is the short answer. I think when the smear is this comprehensive, when people have been banging their heads against the door, trying to get the truth out with facts. I mean, I send them out to my friends. This is a 7-minute read. It'll clear up every misconception you have about Julian Assange. They don't bother to read it. They'll sit and they'll watch a Bourne movie for 2 hours. Or they'll sit and they'll watch a film about journalism like Spotlight for 2 hours. And then they'll feel good about themselves. They'll clink glasses afterwards and say how important the institution is. Again, when we move into the real world, things change. We seem to be more confused. We seem to be a good deal less committed because it takes longer, often, to do the work. I think the sort of undiscussed subtext of the whole Assange problem is laziness on the part of news consumers. It's, they pretend to care about journalism. Nice speeches are made at the Oscars when the screenwriter wins the award. But when it comes to defending the individuals, especially somebody who they think might be a prickly character, because that's what Julian is. Trust me, he tore a strip off my back a few years ago over some piece that I wrote or that we did. It wasn't even inaccurate. It just, there were sins of omission in his mind. He lost his mind. He's not good at understanding the ecosystem. Have any of you ever tried to communicate with your IT people at the office? I think you know what I'm talking about. So it was a little bit like that. But you know what? He's a prickly character. He's no saint. But name me a journalist who's had a bigger impact in the 21st century than Julian Assange on stories that matter. How many journalists have helped end wars? The Iraqis could not go on with that annual renewal of the American military presence after everything he revealed. And they could, Abu Ghraib was damaging to the Americans, but they still managed to stay, and they still managed to get the Iraqi National Assembly, or whatever they call the parliament, to ratify them year in, year out. Assange put an end to that. But, and I talked to Daniel Ellsberg about Julian Assange. Ellsberg is seen as a hero today in America because he ended a war that everyone in America understands was a bad thing, Vietnam. Ellsberg sings Assange's praises, and Assange is depicted in a completely different light. Any more questions? Otherwise, we're going to wrap it up. That's a repeat. We have a first timer here. No, we have a first timer here. And she will precede you. She will precede you. I'm the chairman. I have the ultimate power. Thank you.
Sorry, 1 second.
I just want to say that it seems to me for journalists that they need to have curiosity, do some research, and have skepticism about government statements. We all remember the 45-minute WMD that was supposed to be able to strike London from Iraq. And many journalists followed that. And many journalists have failed to do research on Assange, are prejudiced against Assange, and are completely lacking in curiosity about a man who's just up the road in Belmarsh, in solitary confinement most of the time, against human rights laws, his health failing, as has been shown in the letter to the Lancet from many, many doctors this week. Have you no curiosity, the people who said, we've glorified? Today, we haven't glorified him, we've told some truths for a change. I think journalists need to reframe.
Max, the microphone here, please. And I think this may be our last question because we wanted to wrap this up at 8:30.
It's not so much a question. It's just to raise the awareness because it's happening all over the world, especially in South America. What is being used against Assange is lawfare. It's something that the lawyers have been maybe not talked so much about here, but it has happened in my country, in Brazil, against Lula, and against all democratic governments that want to do something a little bit better for their people. It has happened in Ecuador against Rafael Correa. That's why he had to go and live in Brussels. And it's been happening in Bolivia, it's been happening in Chile, Argentina, with Kirchner. So this is something that when you don't have anything against any crimes committed, so you invent a crime and you completely destroy the character of the person in power. It doesn't matter if it is a political figure, if it's a journalist. It has happened with Greenwood because he's disclosed the truth about the car wash operation in Brazil. And it's been happening all over. We need to be aware of it, and journalists especially, please.
It's happening in the Philippines right now. Yes. It's happening in the Philippines right now with ABS-CBN, which is the country's biggest broadcast network. Duterte is trying to put them out of business using a form of lawfare, as you pointed out. Well, in the absence of any more questions, just one over there. This will be the last question.
I'm not a journalist actually, I'm a translator, but I read John Pilger's very, very good article in Counterpunch, and he talks about, what might happen to Julian Assange if he gets extradited and goes in, is on trial in the States. He could go into the very dark American prison system and never be heard of again. And whatever you say about him, like him or not or anything, he does not deserve that. We should be very grateful to him, as you said. But what can we do, just ordinary people, now? Or is it too late? Is it just all done and dusted and that's where he's off to, down into the bowels of the American prison service?
Saturday, 11:30, Australia House.
Yay!
You want to elaborate on that a little bit?
No. Curious people apparently have turned up so they can find out.
No. Come on. It's not a secret, so perhaps you should announce it.
The Don't Extradite Assange campaign is organising some things. The Twitter is @DEA campaign, Facebook is @DEA campaign, Instagram is @BDA campaign. On Saturday, as the gentleman was saying, we have Chrissy Hine, Roger Waters performing in Parliament Square. There's going to be a march that goes from Australia House to Parliament Square, where there'll be them performing. There'll also be Yanis Varoufakis speaking, Vivian Westwood will be speaking, MIA, Loki, Brian Eno, etc. So turn up and show your support, because essentially also what's transpired over this case is that the First Amendment doesn't apply to foreign nationals of the US. So if you're not American, anything you say that they find unsavory, unfavorable, you could be called into extradition or be targeted for attack, etc., and be considered lawful. So this affects all of us, and we have to